Hello and welcome to this webinar on the overview of demand and capacity planning. We're going to be looking at a kind of beginner's introduction level training on what demand and capacity is and how you might start doing it. But first of all, let's just introduce ourselves. There's two of us on the call today. So I'm on the left, I'm Alice Lunston. I head up the demand and capacity team, so I've got quite a good overview of what the whole team does and how we work. And we've also got Matthew on the line. Matthew, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Matthew O'Reilly. I'm also a member of the Demand and Capacity Programme team. My focus within the team is around stakeholder engagement, but also leading on our work with community and mental health providers.
Brilliant, thanks Matthew. So just before we start, I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be covering today. We're going to be looking at what demand and capacity planning is. So what do we mean when we say that? A beginner's guide, so really starting at first principles. So for those of you who are new to this or really kind of just starting out on it all, this is starting with absolute first principles. We're then going to go into some of those fundamental principles that underpin demand and capacity. So we're looking at demand and the capacity, and then looking at waiting lists and backlogs. And then finally, we're looking at what next in the practical application, because we do realise that a lot of the theory only really gives value if it's applied. So it's all very well having that, but you need to have the tools and the guidance to just get yourself started as well. We won't be covering model walkthroughs specifically today. So there's a number of models that the team have developed and that are freely available. But because different people are going to need different models, we're going to spend the time on the overall principles, and there's some really detailed walkthroughs on our website and on Future NHS. So there's the option to kind of go into the detail of whichever model you feel is going to work best for you. So just to give a little bit of an overview of who we are as a team, we're a demand and capacity programme, and we focus on capacity planning at both service level and system level. Most of the content today is more orientated towards service level modelling. The underlying principles are the same no matter what you're doing, but there are quite a few system level resources as well. So a lot of them are on our Future NHS page, and if you're interested, do have a look through. But just to give a little bit of a context of the background of who we are and where we're coming from. So starting at the beginning, what is demand and capacity planning? We're going to play a short video now, which will hopefully give you a bit of context of what we mean when we say demand and capacity planning, but also a little bit of context about how it's relevant to different audiences and different people who are part of that work.
Colin has an outpatient appointment at the hospital today where Mariam works as a nurse. They both rely on the bus to get them there. To provide them with a good service, a whole team of people must work together to design efficient routes, keep buses working and make sure they have enough drivers. But sometimes buses are early and sometimes they are late. There is also variation in demand, meaning there might be more passengers at certain times or on certain routes. The healthcare system faces similar challenges. It is normal for demand for a service to change through the year. Sometimes this will mean the demand for a service exceeds capacity. So how do we plan better for variation in demand? If we compare recent demand data against our staffing resources for the same time period, we can model future demand and anticipate system pressures before they arise. This is demand and capacity planning, and it's more than just a data exercise. Demand and capacity models help us visualise a service's performance and the likelihood that it will meet patient demand, meaning Colin won't have to wait for treatment any longer than necessary. With good data, demand and capacity models help visualise how a service is performing and how likely it is to meet the demand from patients. Ensuring you have the data to input into the models can be time-consuming, but how do you know otherwise if you are planning to use your resources efficiently? Let's look at how demand and capacity planning can help you. For providers, when operational, clinical and informatics staff come together and commit to demand and capacity planning, the resulting improvements can benefit patients, staff and taxpayers. Input from consultants ensures patient-centred pathways, and booking staff, ward clerks and receptionists learn more about what changes they can implement in order to make things work more smoothly. Better evidence also helps trust finance directors decide how to allocate resources strategically. This minimises costly waiting list initiatives and agency work, and ensures planning accommodates realistic demand for services. As with buses, making health services effective and efficient requires mapping out the system. For Chief Operating Officers, demand and capacity is a large but invaluable undertaking. Once mapped, trusts can redesign service pathways based on demand and capacity models in order to maximise resources. And as the trust's capacity begins accounting for variation in patient demand, Colin's experience as a patient will improve. This is also true in the complex contexts of community and mental health services. In these cases, patients can require treatment and care for a longer period of time, so understanding how their needs change is crucial to providing good care. So demand and capacity planning in community and mental health services requires a more sophisticated model, but the underlying methodology still works to help create a clearer picture of the service. There are similar challenges in data collection and reliability, but investing the time will significantly benefit patients and staff. And without sufficient demand and capacity planning, experience shows patient lists will grow longer, which can affect clinical outcomes. Commissioners also have a responsibility for this. With a good understanding of demand and capacity, commissioners can take a strategic view of the local health system, then work with providers to make evidence-based plans and promote existing best practices. They can also ask the right questions at assurance meetings to ensure providers make the most of their demand and capacity planning. Then they can be more confident that providers will meet their targets and patients will receive the care they need. Demand and capacity work does require an initial investment of time and resources, but the improvements to care and efficiency have been shown to make a real difference to patients. Your first plan might not be perfect, but it will improve with every iteration, and going through the process together will generate dialogue and trust across different services and departments. Commissioners will better understand providers, administrators will better understand clinicians, and so on. Redesigned pathways will work more efficiently, and staff will feel empowered to act when problems arise. And your wait lists will become sustainable. Learn more about demand and capacity planning with the resource pack available as part of the joint National Demand and Capacity Programme, and help Colin on his way.
So hopefully that has given you an overview of why it's important and why it's something that you'd want to be doing. And now we're going to go into a little bit more of the details of the what, the how and the when. So before we go into what modelling is, I'm going to start with what it's not. It is not rocket science. So there's a real variation in terms of how comfortable people are with numbers and how much they like to get under the hood of things. Some of you will be absolutely dying to understand how all of the equations work and how the calculations are done, and that like under the hood theory of the modelling. Others will be sat here thinking, oh my gosh, I don't know if I'll be able to do this. I'm not a numbers person. How's this going to work? Do I need to brush up on my GCSE maths? So this is just to reassure you really that it isn't rocket science. There are some fundamental numerical principles that we will be going through, but they really aren't at all complicated. And for those of you who don't want, or aren't so interested in the number side of things, there is a huge role for you in terms of the wider work and really understanding how services are functioning, and the models will do all of that calculation for you. What it is useful to understand is what the metrics are that are influencing those equations, so that you've got an understanding of what the variables are that are going to make a difference. For those of you who do really like to get under the bonnet and want to really understand the nuts and bolts of it, there is loads more on our Future NHS and external website that can go into that in a bit more detail. So we're not going to go into loads of detail today. This is, as I say, kind of beginner overview, but those resources are there for those of you who do want to kind of really get into the long grass with it. And we really like to start with reminding everyone that it is a collaborative exercise. So drawing on the fact that some people are going to be very much numbers people and other people aren't, there's a space for both and there's a real necessity for both and for having that range of perspectives of how a service works. So modelling is going to be about looking at numbers, but it's also going to be about just looking at the reality of how a service works. And to get that reality in a meaningful way, you're going to have lots of people working together. We don't have it as much as we used to, but it used to be quite common that we'd hear from analysts who were effectively locked in a darkened room on their own and told to do demand and capacity modelling. And inevitably, they would find it very difficult, but then when they did present something, they'd probably get a lot of criticism of like, oh no, that data doesn't reflect the reality of what's happening. I don't recognise that data. It's not real. It's not meaningful, which is probably true because you do need both parts to be working together, both people who are operationally in the service and running it and understanding what's happening on a day-to-day basis, and then that maybe that more technical support. And please don't forget the booking and administrative staff. They tend to have a huge amount of insight into how appointments are booked and how things are working in that kind of real life way. So it should be operationally owned, but also have a firm clinical input as well. And it's a journey. So again, going back to the analyst in a darkened room who's asked to do demand and capacity, it's probably not something that you should think of as being a one-off task or exercise. It's very much about an iterative process that builds over time, and you're finding more about your service as you're doing it and more about what's going on. But also probably as you're doing things, you'll be changing things. So things will change both in terms of service provision, but also potentially in terms of demand profile. So it's really an ongoing process to kind of continue to model what's happening, but also a journey for you as an individual in terms of learning, but for your organisation. So it's a kind of double journey for you as a person, but also as the organisation at the same time. And it can be a really exciting and enlightening journey. But I think it is worth thinking of it as something ongoing rather than a one-off activity. So with the health warnings sort of out of the way, let's look at what actually the beginner's guide is. So what is it that we mean by a model? So a model at its simplest is a way of simulating a real life situation with mathematical equations. So you've got something that's happening in real life and you want to be able to understand it and think about what might happen. So we've got these weather symbols on the screen because one of the forms of modelling and forecasting that a lot of us are really familiar with are weather forecasts. And obviously the accuracy of these vary, and you wouldn't stake your life on the outcomes of them, but it's a really useful indicator of what you might expect and how you can plan. So it's about understanding what's happening in that real life situation and then being able to just, play a few what if scenarios and also understand what might be coming your way. So when using a model for demand and capacity planning particularly, there are a few things that it can really help with and can give you sort of good intelligence on. So one of them is quantifying your gaps. So if you've got a mismatch between your demand and your capacity, it allows you to identify that, but also quantify it so that you've got that kind of solid understanding to be able to take forward. It can also help you to understand your service. So all of that collaborative working that we were talking about, where you're bringing in different stakeholders and really looking at how the service works, that will be useful for people in a whole range of other ways. You'll find ways of talking to each other and using a shared language, which will help with other things. So it's about that kind of fleshing out of a shared understanding, which can be really, really valuable. And then hopefully it will be allowing you to plan ahead. So you can use that knowledge to look at what if scenarios. And for example, if you're trying to bring in a waiting list initiative, it can give you some metrics about how long you should be needing to run that to get things back down to a manageable level. Or if you're looking at changing something in your service in terms of provision, it gives you a sense of what that might look like and what the impact of that might be. Broadly, talking of changes to services, broadly there are two main approaches when you want to change something. So you can make a change live and then see what happens. And we've got our Bogner Birdman in the top left-hand corner there as an example, or you can build a model that simulates what's going to happen so that you've got that prior knowledge of a fairly good understanding of what's likely to happen. I think it's really useful to reflect on what your organisational approach is, but I would also say that I think in the NHS there's probably a fair amount of both happening. And sometimes there's good reasons for either. So for example, during COVID, I think we probably did a lot of the making changes happen and making changes live and then seeing what happened, because we didn't necessarily have the data to be able to model, because we didn't know already how that was going to pan out. There were too many unknowns. But then other parts of COVID definitely were done through modelling. So for example, the rollout of the vaccines programme, our team was quite heavily involved in some of the modelling to work on that. So it's about reflecting, but also thinking about what the right approach is at different times. So we've got a little picture here with a skydiving example, because we've got a couple of skydivers in the team. But I suppose, again, a bit of a health warning. You may set out with a plan that looks a lot like this picture on the left, which is all very ordered and very symmetrical, and it feels very kind of well planned and what you're expecting. When you first start, it might feel a little bit more like this. And I suppose I just wanted to kind of make the point that most of the people on that left-hand photo will probably have looked and felt a bit like the right-hand photo at some point. Again, it's part of the journey, it's part of that process of learning, and it's very hard to get to the left-hand side without going through the right-hand side first. So just be a bit kind with yourself. If things are feeling a bit messy to start with, it probably means that you're digging into the right bits and you're getting to the right space, but just don't be too disheartened if that's what you experience. I'm now going to hand over to Matthew, who's going to take us through some of the fundamental principles of demand capacity.
Thanks, Alice. So I'm going to talk about some of the basics about demand and capacity, but also some of the misconceptions that we see and hear quite frequently. And I think in terms of basics, it's probably best to start out by stressing that activity is not the same as demand. And hopefully this can be one of your key takeaways from listening to this. Activity is what you actually did and represents the capacity that you had available. So if you use this for planning, you will not take account of gaps in capacity or unmet pressures on your service or your team. If you have a mismatch in your required and available capacity, then this means that ultimately patients are going to wait longer and your waiting lists will be longer. And there may be longer intervals between appointments. And ultimately, patients will not be receiving the level of service that you want to provide. I'm going to move on to consider some of the terminology used when we're discussing demand and capacity and also in modelling. And we'll start with demand. And this might be the number of referrals, the number of requests for the service that you're providing, the number of patients that you need to see. And this can include existing patient caseloads in community and mental health services or more complex services. The required capacity is in effect the resources needed to meet the demand. And this can be clinical resources, but also non-clinical resources in terms of equipment, estate, such as room availability or physical space, number of beds, number of scanners or X-ray machines, for instance. The available capacity are the resources you actually have available. And in terms of clinical resources, you might want to consider if you have any vacant posts. So you might want to consider looking at your in-post available capacity compared to what you might have in establishment and look at what the difference between those two measures is. We look at waiting lists, or you might, depending on the service or the nature of the team, your specialty you're providing, it might be a backlog or it might be your queue size. And this is in effect how many patients are waiting to access the service at a given point in time. And it might be useful and helpful to look at this over a period of time to track how this has changed. And finally, the activity. This is what you did during a given period of time. So the actual number of contacts or the actual number of attendances that have actually happened. So we're going to move on to start to look at pathways and in effect consider the order that events happen. And when we're looking at pathways, we think about what typically happens, what order should it happen in, when should it happen, or how frequently should it happen, and then what would be the maximum wait for each stage within that pathway. And you can see here we've got a very simplistic view of a very simple pathway, which is probably not like many of the pathways that you're used to managing or working within, but it's purely for illustrative purposes. And you can see here that the pathway starts with a referral that then gets triaged, and then a patient will move on to receive a first contact and then on to a follow-up contact, or probably more likely multiple follow-up contacts. So when we're starting to look at our pathway, it's really helpful if we can map the pathway. And we're looking here at a pathway that was created by a colleague who presented on a previous webinar with us. And this was a segment of the pathway map for the continent service that he was managing. And appreciate it's quite difficult to see on the slide here, but hopefully it gives you an illustration that there are lots of different steps involved, lots of different parts to the pathway. And essentially we need to look at each component part. And if we start small, we can build up the level of detail and the size of the pathway map. It's important to note that if you start at a high level, you might well lose some of the detail and then not notice a particular issue or backlog or constraint within your pathway. And this pathway map helped the service lead identify a number of different parts of the pathway where there were differences between teams that had come together from different organisations to form a new team, but improvements that could be made to make things more consistent and to streamline some of the elements of the pathway. And there are a few helpful hints in the blue box on the slide. So if you define the first and last steps, that gives you the scope of your pathway. If you go in sequence, so starting from the first step, working through towards the last step that you've identified, it's really important to map the current process only, and then the conversations you can have around this help you to look at what you might want to change or what you might want to improve within the service. And a really good suggestion is to have an issue park and an idea park, whereby you can start to keep a log of some of those issues that you identify as you're developing your pathway map, and an idea park for keeping track of all those great ideas that you come up with as you're working on the pathway mapping, so that they're not lost when you get to the end of the process. And there's some more really useful resources about process and pathway mapping, which you can have a look at after the session to help you get started. So we will be sharing the slide pack and the links that you can have a look at afterwards. So moving on, we're going to look at flows, bottlenecks and constraints and how these impact on your demand and capacity. We've got the simple pathway here, so the triage, the first contacts, first treatments, and follow-up contacts. And we can see that there are identified a number of tendencies or triages that can take place on a given day within our pathway. And what we're going to look at is identifying where the constraint or the bottleneck within the pathway is here. So we can see that we can complete 20 triages a day, 10 first contacts a day, 20 first treatments a day, and 20 follow-up contacts in a day. So we're going to consider what would be the maximum number of patients that can flow through our pathway. And we can see that the constraint here is the first contact, because we can only get 10 patients through this part of the pathway. And the constraint is, in effect, the process with the smallest amount of capacity available, or the smallest amount of throughput. And if you were wanting to increase your capacity or increase your throughput through your pathway or your system, then this is where you would focus and identify how you might allocate additional resources to this step within your pathway. And appreciate this is a very simple example, but hopefully it gives you an idea of how you identify where the constraint or the bottleneck is. So I'm going to hand back over to Alice at this point to talk about a couple of books that further explore the theory of constraints.
Thanks, Matthew. So as we said, it's the example we've given is incredibly simplistic. It's in looking at a pathway that is unrealistically simple. But if you want to get into understanding a bit more about it and kind of understanding the nuance when you're looking at a much more complex and therefore realistic system, there are two books that go into that in a lot of detail and are able to give you a lot of practical examples of how to apply it. So there's The Goal by Goldratt, which is kind of the seminal text, I guess, for the theory of constraints. It was published in the 80s. It's published millions of copies. It's quite easy to get hold of. And it's set in a manufacturing plant. And then you've got Pride and Joy, which was written by Alex Knight, and is effectively translating the goal into a healthcare service. So the same principles, but in a healthcare service. Both books have a possibly slightly unexpected style. So both of them are written as a sort of novella sort of narrative style. So it's like reading a story rather than a business book. So a lot of business books are quite dry and can be a bit difficult to wade through, and quite technical. These cover the technical details, but do it in a more kind of story-like way. It's one of those things, I mean, it does make them a lot easier to read, which is great. If you're not expecting it, it can be a bit of a surprise. So you get to hear about their love life woes as well as their woes in work. So it's a bit of a, for me personally, when I first read The Goal, I was a little bit surprised because it just wasn't what I was expecting. But having said that, it does make it really easy to read, really easy to digest, and really easy to understand. I would say that if you can get hold of a copy of Pride and Joy, having it translated into a healthcare service setting really does help with the understanding. It makes it a lot clearer, and it just, you know, it's immediately understandable how it would apply. The principles are exactly the same though. So reading The Goal will give you the same principles. You'll just need to do a little bit more of the translation into reality and what that would look like in a healthcare setting. I've been told that Pride and Joy is no longer available as like a new copy, but you can quite often find secondhand copies. So if you look on secondhand bookstores online, you might be able to find one. I've also been told that libraries are often able to get hold of them. But The Goal, there are millions of copies, so it's really, really easy to get hold of. So either book will give you the same principles, and they are very easy to read and digest. We had someone asking us recently if they're holiday reading. I'd say the team is divided on that front. Some people have read it on their holidays. Other people feel like that's a bit too much work brain space on a sun lounger. I will leave that to your personal discretion, but they are very digestible. And there are some really practical things that can actually make a huge difference to productivity and how effective services are running. I'll hand back over to Matthew.
Thanks, Alice. So we'll talk more about modelling and understanding demand. And I think it's key to bear in mind that you will often need to incorporate some assumptions into your modelling. And in our models, we include a notes tab so that you can document any assumptions that you make, so that you know if you pick up the model again at a later date, or if someone else does, if you're working as part of a team, then there's transparency, and you're able to identify and to log any actions or improvements that you think might be important to take note of. And very much it's about using the data to tell a story. I think we're often data rich but information poor, and the modelling is about more than just numbers. It's really important to have a good understanding about the service, the team, or the pathway that you're looking to complete a model for. And the data must tell a story about that team or that service. Collaboration with key colleagues is crucial to help tell the story, and I think that goes back to what we talked about, Alice talked about earlier, that actually the end goal is to create a model that is representative of the service. That said, there are often issues with data quality and data robustness, and we've highlighted some of them here on this slide. And I think the key is to remember that if the data is not available, or you know that there are data quality issues with the data that you've got available, then you can still complete a model, but acknowledge that some of those data issues or data quality issues may form part of your improvement plan or action plan following on from that model. And as long as the assumptions have been agreed with the service lead, the clinical colleagues working on the modelling with you, then you can still use that to complete your model. So analysing the demand and how it varies over time is key to understanding how much capacity you need to provide. Looking at data over time is really important, and the local knowledge and service knowledge is crucial to understanding the patterns and service changes that might have happened over time, and to help understand any changes in demand. When you're looking at the start and endpoints to use in terms of the data for your modelling for the time frame that you're going to use, then we'd recommend that you use the most representative time period of the service currently. I think previous to COVID, we would probably have suggested that if possible, use the latest 2 to 3 years worth of data, for instance. However, the key now is to have conversations with your service lead, operational leads, to determine what time period of data is most representative to use, and to consider whether there have been any changes in service delivery, or if there have been any external factors which might impact on the demand for your service. So for the modelling, we tend to focus on using what is good enough. However, there are some really great resources here about understanding data from our colleagues in the Making Data Count team and CUSA teams. I would suggest to have a look at some of these resources afterwards. There's some really useful hints and tips here. And I'm going to hand back over to Alice at this point.
Thanks, Matthew. So hopefully that's given you a good understanding of the principles. We're now going to have a look at demand, available capacity and required capacity, so the main metrics that you use in the modelling when you're planning things. So first of all, understanding available capacity. So your available capacity has got three main metrics, or two main metrics. You've got your core capacity and ad hoc capacity. So in the models that we use, most of them, if not all of them, have got different sections that you can populate. And what we mean by those different types of capacity, core capacity would be what you expect to be consistent and available ongoing. Ad hoc capacity can be anything that will be in a more temporary or variable capacity. So it could be bank staff, it could be waiting list initiatives, it could be student placements, anything that you're expecting to either not be permanently there or to vary quite significantly over the year. So we're not talking a little bit of variation for holidays, but huge chunks of the year where it's available or not available. You also need to understand the rotas and templates, and systems may be out of date. So again, this is where things like talking to your booking staff and operational colleagues to really understand the reality is going to be very important. And then operationally verify what's happening. So make sure that it is reflecting what people are seeing on the ground. And digging into your capacity is one of those ones that often takes quite a long time. So again, in terms of that journey, there are a lot of learnings along the way, but it can often be a bit of a time-consuming task. There's one of our models called the light model, which spends a lot of time digging into your capacity, and that can be quite a useful one to start with if that's something that you're wanting to sort of drill into. And then in terms of the detail that you'll need, you need to understand contracted hours don't necessarily, almost certainly won't, equate to available capacity. So you'll need to be able to factor in annual leave, study leave, clinical audit days, bank holidays. Bank holidays is a really important one if you have services or particular things running on Mondays, because the vast majority of bank holidays are on a Monday, so it can throw things out quite a bit compared to services on the rest of the week. But any other non-patient facing time. So if it's a person, there'll be things like annual leave and study leave. If it's a piece of physical equipment, you might need to have maintenance time, or you might just know that it breaks down X number of times a year, or roughly knowing is probably optimistic. But it's just about really making sure that you are accounting for all of those other things that will be using up capacity. We've got a really good case study that unpicks how this has been put into practice, and there's the link at the bottom there. Please do have a look at it, because I think seeing someone doing it in real life really does bring it to life, much more so than me talking about the theory. And then when you're determining your required capacity, it's really important not to use averages. So I think it's a kind of natural assumption that that might be a useful metric, and it's worth knowing about. It can be useful for certain things, but in terms of actually your required capacity, it's not a suitable measure, and we're going to go into why in a minute. We're also going to be looking at why not all demand requires capacity and internally generated demand. So these three metrics, again, I was saying it's not rocket science, and it really isn't, but understanding how these things function and influence is quite important. So in terms of job planning, you're going to be looking at the available capacity and required capacity and understanding all of that. And for a lot of people, that will lead to wanting to look at job planning and potentially changing job planning. There's a massive overlap between demand and capacity work and job planning work, because often that, okay, so what? So we've done this, and now what do we do? A lot of that will be looking at job planning. So there's I would say in terms of Venn diagram, there's quite a significant overlap, but with important little crescent moons either side. It's quite nuanced in terms of whether you're looking at patients versus full-time work versus time versus full-time equivalents. It's how you use those words and how you're understanding them, and having that shared language is really, really important. And then additionally, not all clinicians are necessarily going to be seeing people at the same speed. So again, the difference between if you've got your ad hoc capacity being student placements, the amount of time they're going to need versus a very experienced member of staff could be radically different. So again, it's about really understanding the nature of your capacity and kind of digging into that, and coming back to the collaboration, right people in the room, and having that discussion with the shared language that you can understand together. In terms of the workforce side of things, the clinical workforce productivity team have got some fantastic resources, and we work quite closely with them. So I'd really recommend that you look at their Future NHS platform and look at the resources that are available there, because it really helps to look at the practicalities of the improvements that can be made there and how you go about it and what that means. So it's just a kind of acknowledgement that there is a lot of overlap, and a lot of demand and capacity work will be paired up with workforce productivity work. And then again, carrying on with the collaboration, here's just a little kind of little chart that you can use as a reference guide for getting the team involved at various points, because not everyone will need to be involved in everything as you go along, but you will need that real in the round mix as you're going through. So just something to use as a bit of a reference and to really think through things like, what are your assumptions? What are your client pathways? What capacity is in the team and the roles? And then what is available for client? Like all of those prompt questions that you can work on together to really kind of flesh it out and unpick what's going on. So I started at the beginning with saying that you shouldn't use averages. We've got a short video here on percentiles. So percentiles is what we would suggest that you use instead of using an average. And the video will probably explain far more eloquently than I can exactly how that works and why that's something that we would recommend using when planning your capacity levels.
When planning any kind of service, you have to be sure that the capacity you put in place can deal with the demand that's coming through the door, especially in a sector like ours, where referrals can vary from week to week. Using a waiting list helps smooth this out, but managing a sustainable waiting list is all about matching demand and capacity. Too much capacity could mean wasting valuable resources. Too much demand and not enough capacity, and your waiting list will get longer until it's impossible for you to see all your patients within a maximum waiting time. So where do you draw the line? Just how much capacity do you need to cope with the variability in demand and not allow the waiting list to grow? Agner Erlang was a statistician who developed a method of calculating how to do this in the 1920s. His work suggested that capacity needs to be set to somewhere between the 80th and 85th percentile of the variation of demand. But what is a percentile? A percentile is simply a way of dividing a data set into 100 equal parts. Some percentiles have special names. For example, we call the 50th percentile the median, and the 75th percentile the upper quartile. Let's say if you have a set of 10 measurements and put them in order from lowest to highest, because we have an even number of data points, the 50th percentile will be the midpoint between the two middle values, which in our dataset are 28 and 36. So this will be 32, because 50% of your measurements are either equal to or below that number. Which is why, even though these numbers range from 1 to 100, the 50th percentile isn't 50. Here there are only 3 measurements equal to or over 50, so it's quite exceptional for them to go over 50. In 50% of our measurements, we get a value of 32 or less. Understand? Good. Now that you understand percentiles, let's look at an example based in the real world. Let's say you recorded the number of new referrals you've received in orthopedics every week for the last 20 weeks. There will naturally be some variation from week to week. To find our percentile, like before, we reorder the list by the number of referrals from the smallest to the largest. We now want to figure out which percentile will give us a good balance between over-providing capacity and keeping our waiting list manageable. Erlang's work suggests that this should be between the 80th and 85th percentile. From experience, we have found that the percentile at which you should have your capacity for a healthcare service can be between the 65th to 85th percentiles. In this example, for simplicity, we will use the 80th percentile. 80% of 20 is 16, so we take the week with the 16th highest number of referrals in it, which gives us a value of 75. Assuming that future demand behaves in a similar way, if we aim to see 75 people on our waiting list each week, in only 4 weeks out of 20 would demand outstrip supply, and our waiting list get longer. In the other 16 weeks, we should have enough capacity to meet demand, so the waiting list should get shorter or stay the same length. When trying to decide which percentile to set for the capacity of your own service, you'll need to look at 2 main factors: how urgently your patients need to be seen, and how variable your demand is. As a general rule of thumb, bigger services will experience less variation than smaller ones. So, if you have a small cancer service and your patients need to be seen urgently, within 2 weeks for example, then setting your capacity to the 85th percentile of demand will keep your waiting list shorter and help to ensure that they are all seen in time. On the other hand, a large, non-urgent dermatology outpatient clinic with a relatively stable level of demand will probably have a bit more leeway. So setting the capacity to the 65th percentile of demand might be a better way of resourcing your clinics in this instance. It is only by gathering and reviewing your own figures and assessing the needs of your service and patients that you'll then be able to make an informed judgment about which percentile value to use. This will then enable you to make the best of the resources you have, as well as being able to manage a sustainable and effective waiting list.
So hopefully that has made percentiles a bit clearer for you, and particularly how we're using it in the context of demand and capacity. It always makes me smile when there's the bit that goes, now you understand the percentiles, good, and hopefully you did, but if you didn't, there's just a couple of points that we wanted to go through, just because from a learning styles point of view, people do the penny drops for different people in different ways. So this image here, where you've got effectively a normal distribution curve chopped into slices, is another way of thinking about percentiles. For some of you, you'll be looking at this and being like, well, duh, that's what I thought anyway. For others, you'll be like, nope, that means nothing to me. I understood it before, but this doesn't give me anything. But there will be some probably who are looking at this and going, I get it now. So if you're not one of the ones who are going, you're just going to have to be patient, I'm afraid. But it is one of these graphics we found really help some people to kind of solidify it in their mind. You may also have spotted, and we do confess to the video, that one of the graphs is wrong. So this is probably a better way of viewing it. So the line was in the wrong place. A lot of us reviewed that video and none of us spotted it, which is an ongoing shame for me, but hopefully the principles still come through fairly clearly. This is just a kind of visual representation of where that 75th percentile should sit. And then another concept which we reference in the video, but isn't, again, it's not always instinctively make sense of people, is this concept that larger services have less variation and smaller services have more variation. And the way I like to think about this is the impact that like 1 or 2 patients' decisions would make on the overall numbers. So if you've got quite a small service where you're only really expecting to see 10 people, 1 or 2 people not turning up, or 1 or 2 people being like, oh, you know what, actually, I am going to get in touch, and I've been worried about that for a while, but I'm finally going to get someone to look at it, will make a huge difference to the overall numbers percentage-wise in your service. Whereas if you've got a service that's seeing like 300 people a week and 1 or 2 make a different decision, you're probably not even going to notice. So I hope that helps to just give a bit of a sense of why we say a larger service will tend to have less variation. It's that each decision is a smaller kind of part of the picture, and therefore makes less of a difference to the overall pattern that you're seeing. Because again, in terms of deciding what percentile you want to base at, that's going to be quite an important one. So just as a little summary for percentiles, we would say probably setting at the 75th percentile is a good starting point. As the video talks through, there are various different things that play into that. So the urgency profile and how long people can wait, which we'll be getting onto in a minute. It does vary depending on that service. I would say particularly at the moment where most services are looking at having backlogs and waiting lists that are significantly larger than we saw before COVID and significantly larger than we'd want to be, going for a higher percentile means that you have more scope to sort of bring that waiting list slowly down when there are lulls. So if you're looking at that mountainscape that we had earlier on, where you've got the blue mountain, the line, which is your percentile, The more dips there are underneath that line, the more opportunities you have to reduce waiting lists and to sort of catch up a little bit. The further down the line is, and therefore the less dips there are underneath the line, the less often you are able to do that. And if you didn't have a waiting list, there'd be a risk that you'd be wasting capacity. However, probably in the current climate, that has shifted a little bit. So 75th percentile is probably a good starting point, but it's also worth having operational conversations and just thinking about where you want to put that. Things have changed a little bit in terms of the advice we give post-COVID. So we're now going to be looking at one of the few equations that we've got in here, but quite a simple one, which is determining your required capacity. So your required capacity starts off with what your base capacity is. So that's what we've been talking about with the percentiles, that line that we drew across the mountain range. And you will need to set what percentile you're going to be using there. Once we've got that base capacity, we then take out demand that does not require capacity. So we mentioned this at the start. And demand that doesn't require capacity could be for a number of reasons. So it could be an inappropriate referral, so actually they never needed to be there. It could be a duplicate referral, so you've got the same person twice. It could be that they've moved on to a different pathway. It could be that they were moved off the pathway because they've moved house and they're no longer in the... There's a whole range of reasons why someone might get added initially as potential demand, but actually they get removed before they need any capacity. So you'll need to identify that. Sometimes that will be removed from your data before you get it, but sometimes it isn't, and it's worth being aware of it. We then add on what we call additional demand that the system generates. And that's, again, a phrase that may or may not instinctively resonate for people. But what we mean by that is, a lot of it is around people who haven't attended their appointments or have cancelled at short notice. So if you've got somebody who's booked into an appointment and they either DNA or they cancel, but with so little notice that you're not able to get anyone else into that slot. So effectively that slot is still taking capacity, it is your capacity, but nobody's using it, but the person probably still needs to be seen. So if you've got someone that DNAs and they're not using that slot, that's one slot that they have used up without being seen, but they still need to be seen. So then there's that second slot when they actually do get seen. So that particular patient has effectively used 2 units of capacity rather than 1. So again, you need to be able to quantify how many of those people are needing a slot again and how many of them are at that point discharged. And that will then give you your final required capacity. So hopefully that made sense, but it might also make more sense once you start to use the models and looking at it in a bit more detail. But it's the sort of metrics that can actually make quite a big difference to the overall picture of what you are needing. So then we've got waiting lists, queues and backlogs, which is obviously, particularly at the moment, a very, very pressing issue for the NHS and will potentially be why a lot of you are here. So what we're looking at now is that for any given rate of demand, so the rate that it's coming in, the urgency profile, and then defining the maximum waiting time, you can come up with what's called a sustainable or ideal waiting list size. I do realise that a lot of people are a long way away from where they want to be on this, so I am aware that it's a difficult area, but it's also one of these areas that to get it down, understanding the fundamental metrics of it can make a really big difference. So those are the 3 bits of information you need, and then you can calculate it. So we're going to play a short video now, which will hopefully help you to understand what a sustainable waiting list is and how to calculate it with those simple metrics. At the end of it, there's an equation that shows you how to calculate it, which is about as rocket science mathy as we get in the whole course. So for those of you who are worried about, oh, I'm not a numbers person, this isn't going to be for me, you're very nearly over the hump. But also just to stress again that you don't need to calculate it yourself. It's really important and useful to understand the metrics that are going to make a difference, but you don't actually need to be calculating it yourself. The models will absolutely do that for you.
People tend to think that having people on a waiting list is a bad thing. But in this film, we're going to show you how having a waiting list that is the right size can help offer people choice and flexibility in when they're seen, as well as achieving a maximum waiting time. To help keep things simple, imagine this is a new service, so there's no existing waiting list or backlog. Here is the puzzle. How big does the waiting list need to be in order to meet our own standards by seeing everyone who's referred to us as a routine patient within 5 weeks? And because these are not urgent referrals and life is complicated, we also want to offer appointments with at least 2 weeks' notice. Let's assume an average of 24 patients are being referred every week. In this first starting group are Mary, Mike and Mariana. We offer each of them a choice of week 3, 4 or 5 in which to be seen. Mary can't be seen in week 3 as she has an important work deadline, which she fears might even run into week 4, so she chooses to be seen in week 5. Mike's mum is visiting from Australia in week 3, but she's going home on the Friday, so he chooses week 4. Mariana, on the other hand, has more flexibility with her time and is free to be seen as soon as possible, so chooses week 3. Like Mary, Mike and Mariana, each patient in this first block will have their own reasons for choosing when to be seen. In the first week, another 24 patients are added, and these too will make their own appointment choices, giving us 48 people in the waiting list, with no one having yet been seen. Week 2 arrives, and another 24 people are added, taking the waiting list to 72, still with no one having been seen. In week 3, Mariana and the others from the first block of referrals attend their appointments. Those who've chosen week 4, like Mike with his mum visiting, and those from week 5, like Mary with her work deadline, are yet to attend their appointments. So 8 people have now been seen and come off the waiting list. But don't forget, another 24 people have been added, so the waiting list number is now 88. I know, this keeps going up, but it will stabilise soon, I promise. Now comes week 4. Mike's mum has now gone home, so he and the others like him attend their appointments, along with those who are able to be seen as soon as possible who arrived in the middle of week 1. But the Marys from our initial group and the Mikes from week 1 carry on waiting. Meanwhile, another 24 patients come in and again make a choice about when they want to be seen. This week we've seen 16 patients, but we also have another 24 patients being referred, so the total number on the waiting list is now 96. Let's look at week 5, where everything becomes clear. The Marys from the initial group are now able to fit their appointment in around work. The Mikes from the second block have finished with their personal commitments, and the Marianas from block 3 are also being seen. We're now seeing 24 patients, which is the same number that are being referred into the service. The waiting list number holds still at 96, and it won't go up anymore. Let's see what happens in week 6, when we add and see another 24 people, and in week 7, 8, and 9. As long as the number of people being referred and the number of people having their appointment stays the same, we have an ideal waiting list size of 96. We have arrived at a stable system, and we know that with a waiting list of 96 people, we can offer everyone at least 2 weeks' notice, a wide variety of choice, and see them all inside of our own 5-week target.
So hopefully that has helped to just give context and a bit of practical application of how it works. So just as a bit of a recap, things that you need to know around waiting lists, queues and backlogs. So having a waiting list isn't necessarily an issue in itself if it's the right size. So when we were looking at the percentiles and that mountain range, you've got the ebb and flow, and actually having a waiting list means that if you set your capacity at a level that the 75th percentile, those dips that are underneath the line, having a waiting list means that you can use that capacity really effectively, and it can make it a very effective use of resources. Issues really arise when the waiting list exceeds a certain size. So, and people will have seen this playing out. I'm very aware that this is a very real situation for most of you. So once things get beyond a certain size, you can never see people within the amount of time that you want to, because they've just been waiting there for too long. So even if people are coming in at the same rate that they're going off the waiting list, if it's too big, you just will wait longer. But as I say, it's possible to calculate this, and it does give you quite powerful metrics to be able to do those what if scenarios if you're looking at reducing your waiting list size. A big plea, though, that you do need to look at that balance first. So waiting list initiatives will treat the symptom but not the cause. So you need to get an understanding of what that steady state balance is first. And then this will help you to really quantify what needs to be done to get things down to the right size. So hopefully that's helped with some of the kind of metrics behind capacity, both available capacity and required capacity, and then looking at your demand as well. So I'm going to hand back over to Matthew now, who's going to talk through the what next and practical application. So you've got a bit of a, okay, so now what do we do?
Thank you. So we've covered the theory. So now we're going to look at how do we translate this into the day-to-day modelling and what additional resources are available to you. So we very much see the modelling process as part of an improvement journey. And you can see in the picture here another visualisation really of the skydiver image from back earlier in the session. And your plan might look nice and straightforward like the top image, with the end in sight. However, the reality is far more likely to be the image at the bottom with some adventures on your journey. There may be some obstacles that you might not be prepared for, but you may well find a way of working around them on your way, and using some of the resources that I'll highlight hopefully will help you with this. So demand and capacity modelling, as we've said, is very much an iterative process. What we've been focusing on today is the part of the process circled in red about the theory, and we'll point you in the direction of some of the models and other resources. There is, however, a bigger piece of work circled here, which is that iterative process of completing your first piece of modelling, checking that it makes sense and is representative of the service, and then invariably updating that, repeating that, testing some of the variables, and just working through that cycle. So there are a range of different modelling approaches, and we have a collection of models built by the team that are available for you, and these have all been built in Excel, and they're freely available. Some are available on the NHS England website, others are available through our Future NHS workspace. We do have a document that gives an overview of the different models, which is available through the Future NHS workspace, and I won't cover that in detail now. And we also acknowledge that some people may have built their own models or have access to their own models. If you've got something that works for you, then that's great. And do stick with that. The key is understanding the methodology and the principles that we've talked through today, and we're always keen to hear about your demand and capacity modelling stories. So to access the models, the links are available there to the NHS England website and the Future NHS workspace. So we also want to share at this point some of the learning from others that we've supported with their modelling and from personal experiences. It's fair to say that the first iteration of modelling does usually take quite some time, and it's important to recognise this. However, the learning from that first exercise in terms of finding the right stakeholders, understanding the service, setting up the data extracts, the processes to validate the data and undertake the process mapping does get quicker with further iterations and further models, as you'll be able to take some of that forward into those other models that you work on then. And the improvements that you make along the way are as important as the modelling itself. So ultimately, keep sight of the final goal, that improving the service so patients get better care and better outcomes is the priority and the end goal. So some of the other benefits will fall out from the conversations and the work that you do along the way. And it's really important to remember to document all of those benefits or improvements, as it's very easy to forget some of those as you progress, and you may well miss some of those actions that you want to take on board. So at a glance, you can see if there is a mismatch between your demand and capacity. You will have evidence to support the existing knowledge that you may well have of where you think the issues exist. The modelling provides an opportunity for the team to talk through the pathways for the patients and how support is delivered, and often identify improvements to that and identify some of those blockages and constraints that we talked about earlier and discuss about how you might well want to overcome some of those. So we do have some e-learning courses that are available to you through the e-learning for health platform. There are links on the slide here, so do have a look at those, and hopefully they'll also help provide some additional knowledge from this session. As we mentioned earlier, our Future NHS workspace is probably your key place to find resources and receive updates. There are a whole range of different resources, some of which you can see highlighted on the slide here. The link is there to access or to join the workspace, and I would also highlight that we do have a demand and capacity forum that's available through the workspace, where you can post questions and queries either to the team or to peers within that community of practice, and that's really well used in terms of the amount of questions that are being posted and responses, so do have a look out for that. We have an open online course available on the Future NHS platform, and this gives a step-by-step approach to modelling. There are 7 different modules that you can work through, along with supporting materials. So do check that out there, even if you want to look at particular modules or work through the whole series. We have a growing library of case studies where you can read about how others have applied demand and capacity modelling, or some of the methodologies that we've talked about today, and ultimately what does it mean in real life, in real services. There might not be a case study that exactly matches your service, but it might give you a good starting point or some inspiration to help with your modelling journey. We have a range of podcasts. We've highlighted a couple of them here. There are 11 currently available, and we're adding to these. They're available through SoundCloud or on Spotify. And through these podcasts, you can hear about how others have undertaken some of their demand and capacity modelling, the methodologies that they've used, and some of the successes that they've had along their demand and capacity journey. We run support surgeries, so if you're looking to get started with your demand and capacity journey, you've undertaken some modelling but you've got some questions, or you're looking at the scope of your modelling, and you want to discuss this, then you can book into a pre-bookable 45-minute slot throughout the week to have a face-to-face conversation over Teams with members of the demand and capacity team. So to book a slot, then just contact us on the email address here with the nature of your question or query, and we'll get back to you to book a slot in. And finally, here are just some of the key links with how you can stay in touch with the demand and capacity team. So you can visit the website, you can sign up to our bulletin, join our demand and capacity network on Future NHS, or if you've got a particular question or query, then drop us an email. Thank you. I hope you found this useful.